In a forgotten town where the wind carried more secrets than stories, a young orphan teacher named Elsie May stood in her one-room schoolhouse, holding the last thing her mother ever gave her, a quilt. Time had faded the fabric, but it still held warmth. A strange comfort from a woman who had died with too many questions left unanswered. The school board had just announced the building would be torn down by the end of the month, leaving Elsie not only without work, but without the only place that ever made her feel she belonged. That night, as she returned to her creaky old cabin, she folded the quilt in her lap like she had countless times before. But this time, she noticed something strange. One of the stitches, a red, uneven thread shaped like a star, was slightly raised. Her fingers hesitated, then tugged at it gently. To her surprise, something crinkled beneath the lining. She reached inside and pulled out a thin, brittle parchment. It was a map, not a modern one, no highways or clear landmarks, but an old hand-drawn sketch with faded ink and unfamiliar names. Across the top, it bore the name of the town, but not as it was known today. This was its name from nearly 100 years ago. Arrows pointed toward the edge of the map, circling something near what looked like the willow grove just past the town's edge. At the very bottom, beneath a stitched X in red ink, were the chilling words, "Claim what's buried." Her heart pounded. Why would her mother sew a map into a quilt? Why now? Why her? She spent the night comparing the map to modern drawings of the area, pacing the floor, heart restless. There was a pull in her chest, as if something long dormant had stirred the moment the map touched her hands. By morning, Elsie could no longer ignore the pull. She packed a lantern and an old shovel, wrapped herself in a coat too thin for the cold, and walked into the early dawn fog toward the forgotten willow grove. No one ever went there anymore. Locals claimed the ground was cursed, that cattle avoided it, that nothing grew beneath those weeping branches. But Elsie walked with a quiet determination, guided by symbols etched into old bark and fence posts that mirrored those on the map. At the very center of the grove, beneath the oldest tree with roots like twisted arms, she began to dig. The soil was wet and stubborn, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. She dug until her hands blistered, until the lantern's glow turned gold against the rising sun. Then, the shovel struck wood. She gasped. Brushing the dirt away, she uncovered a small wooden chest, sealed but not locked. With trembling fingers, she pried it open. Inside was not treasure, at least not in the way most would define it. Wrapped in a velvet cloth was a single leather-bound journal. Its pages crackled with age. On the very first one, in ink so faded it seemed whispered from another time, were the words, "To the rightful daughter, this town belongs. To you more than you know." Elsie fell back, stunned. The town belonged to her? Or was it a metaphor? A forgotten inheritance? Her mother had never spoken of secrets, never hinted at legacy. But this journal, buried beneath a cursed grove, told a different story. She cradled it to her chest, unsure whether she had just uncovered her destiny or her undoing. And though the sun was now rising, the darkness surrounding her past had only just begun to lift. Elsie sat by the dim light of her lantern long after the sky had turned pale with morning, the journal resting in her lap like a sleeping child. Its leather cover, though cracked with age, still held an air of importance, like it had been waiting years, perhaps generations, for the right hands to open it. She turned the brittle pages slowly, careful not to tear them. Each one was filled with her mother's handwriting, but the words spoke of a time much older. It wasn't a diary in the typical sense. It was a record, entries detailing the foundation of the town, its founders, and most shockingly, the hidden truths they had taken great care to erase. The first few entries were dated back to the early 1800s, far before Elsie's mother would have been born. But the voice in the writing was familiar. As she read, Elsie realized the journal had been passed down from mother to daughter, generation after generation, and each woman had added her chapter until it reached her. Buried between the pages were tales of injustice, secrets buried with land deeds, and stories of a town built on promises that were never kept. A woman named Ruth, the first writer, had once owned half the land the town now stood on, but she was forced to sign it over to a group of men under threat. They promised to build schools, homes, safety. Instead, they divided the land among themselves and left her with a plot no bigger than a stable. The journal detailed every betrayal, every name, every bribe, and how it all led to the very fabric of the town's power structure. Elsie's fingers shook as she realized her family hadn't just lived here. They had built the foundation of it all, and it had been stolen. Her mother, it seemed, had spent her life quietly watching the town evolve, waiting for the right moment, or the right heir, to reveal the truth. That moment had come, and the weight of it pressed down on Elsie like the roof of the collapsing schoolhouse she now feared losing. The next day, she returned to the grove and buried the chest again, marking it with a small stone only she would recognize. The journal stayed with her, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her cabin. For days, she continued teaching, pretending all was normal while each night she devoured the journal's contents. She began connecting the names in the journal to those in the town today, descendants of the very men who had rewritten its history. Some were now council members, others landowners. One was even the school superintendent, who had decided to demolish her classroom and replace it with a commercial building. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was deliberate erasure. Elsie knew she had two choices: remain quiet like the women before her, or use what she had found to reclaim what was once rightfully theirs. She began making notes, quietly researching property deeds at the dusty county clerk's office, requesting copies under the pretense of a school history project. She collected records, dates, land maps, cross-referencing everything with the journal's pages. What she discovered next shook her to the core. The land where the schoolhouse stood had originally been promised to Ruth's descendants under a legacy clause in a charter that was mysteriously lost. But now, thanks to the journal and her research, Elsie had the proof. Her hands trembled as she copied the final page of the clause and circled the date. If she was right, she still had time to stop the demolition. But she'd need to act quickly and carefully, because if the wrong people discovered what she now knew, they would stop at nothing to keep the past buried. What Elsie didn't realize, however, was that someone had already noticed her visits to the clerk's office, and someone else had begun to follow her. The wind blew harsher the next morning, as if the land itself had awakened with a warning. Elsie stood in the empty schoolhouse, sunlight cutting through the cracked windows like blades. Every desk she passed felt like a chapter about to be erased. She held the copied clause tight against her chest, the one she had found buried in the county records. Proof that the land the school stood on had once been promised to her bloodline. Her family's legacy, hidden behind bureaucracy and buried under silence. Now that truth pulsed in her hands. But with truth came danger. And something deep in her gut told her she was not walking this path alone anymore. Over the last few days, she had felt it, shadows at the corner of her eyes, footsteps that didn't match her own on the gravel outside her cabin, a sense of being watched even in daylight. The small town had always been quiet, but this was a different kind of silence, one that listened. She didn't want to believe it at first. Maybe it was her mind playing tricks, driven by sleepless nights and old paper. But when she returned home that evening, she found her door slightly ajar. Nothing appeared stolen. Not the journal, not the map, but her chair had been moved. Her rug shifted slightly to the left, and a trail of fresh mud stopped just short of her stove. Someone had been inside. Someone knew she had found something. She lit every lantern in the cabin, closed the curtains tight, and slept with the journal under her pillow. The next morning, she left early, not to teach, but to visit the one person she never imagined. Turning to her late mother's old friend, Hattie. Hattie was the town's oldest living resident, a recluse who ran the antique store near the river bend. Most people called her strange. Some whispered that she'd gone mad with grief after her husband vanished decades ago, but Elsie remembered her as the only adult who ever spoke kindly to her. After her mother's funeral, she found Hattie arranging cracked porcelain teapots on the shelf. The woman didn't seem surprised to see her. When Elsie showed her the journal, Hattie said nothing for a long time. Then she simply nodded. "It's come to you now," she murmured, as if she'd been expecting it. She told Elsie that the quilt had been passed from woman to woman in secret, always stitched with some part of the map, always preserved for the next who would dare to act. "Your mother knew the burden," Hattie said quietly, "but she also knew you'd have the fire. The quilt, the journal, even the claws. All of it had been designed not to reclaim riches, but to restore memory, a kind of justice that couldn't be bought." Hattie warned her, though, if Elsie went public with the truth, the council wouldn't go down quietly. Some of them had buried too much for too long. Elsie returned to her cabin with resolve burning in her chest. She stayed up late, crafting a letter to the town's historical commission and attaching copies of every record she had found. If they approved her petition, the school would be designated a historical site, protected by law. She sent it the next morning, but she didn't know that someone else had intercepted her visit to the post office. That evening, as she reached her door, a white envelope lay pinned to it with a single nail. No name, no stamp, just 5 words in shaky ink. Stop digging, or you'll drown. Elsie stared at the envelope nailed to her door. Her breath caught somewhere between fear and fury. She knew then that her fight had stirred something deeper than local politics. This was no longer about a condemned schoolhouse or dusty pages in a journal. This was about control, legacy, and fear of exposure. She peeled the envelope from the door with careful fingers and read the words again, "Stop digging, or you'll drown." There was no signature, no symbol, just the eerie sense that someone had been close enough to touch her door, close enough to silence her if they wanted to. But instead of retreating, something inside her sharpened. The kind of fire her mother must have seen when she stitched that map into the quilt. Elsie was tired of being afraid. She walked into her cabin and lit every lamp, until the walls glowed like they were on fire. She laid the journal, the land clause, and the copied maps on her kitchen table, staring at them like pieces of a puzzle that refused to hide anymore. 2 days passed. She heard nothing back from the historical commission. No letter, no call. But she noticed something strange. The schoolhouse that had been scheduled for demolition was suddenly boarded up. Pending review. The demolition notice was gone. Someone had read her petition. Someone had started to ask questions. That same morning, she found tire tracks outside the clerk's office leading deep into the woods, near the grove where she'd reburied the chest. Fear curled in her belly. Whoever had followed her was getting closer to the truth, and closer to her. She spent the evening making multiple copies of the journal pages and storing them in hidden places. Around town, beneath the library floorboards, behind hymnals in the church, inside a broken clock at Hattie's shop. If they came for her, the truth would still remain. By the end of the week, a strange stillness fell over the town. People watched her longer than usual in the grocery store. Conversations hushed when she entered the diner, and when she passed by the town hall, she spotted Councilman Rivers, the very man who'd pushed to demolish the schoolhouse, talking to the sheriff in whispers. She walked faster, heart racing. At night, she began to sleep in different places. Some nights at Hattie's store, other nights inside the schoolhouse itself, curled in a blanket beneath the blackboard. The town she'd once called home had turned into a maze of glances and half-spoken threats. But it was on the 6th day that everything shifted. A knock came at her cabin door just after sunrise. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a teenage boy, face pale and frightened. He held out a folded note and said, "My granddad said you need to see this. Said it's your time now." Then he ran off before she could ask who his grandfather was. She opened the note with shaking hands. It was another map, but not one she had seen before. This one was older, the lines drawn in black charcoal. At the center of it was a name, Ruth, and beneath it, a symbol of an open eye. A hidden chamber beneath the old mill, it seemed to say. Another layer of secrets buried in plain sight. Elsie's breath caught. The town had hidden one truth beneath the willow trees. What else had they buried beneath its bones? She knew then the map in the quilt was just the beginning. The story wasn't finished. And if she wanted to change the town, she had to dig deeper, into the soil, the lies, and the very foundation of everything they feared she'd uncover. But she had no idea what waited for her beneath the mill floor, only that someone else was already watching her get closer. The sky was still bruised with dawnlight when Elsie reached the old mill, tucked at the far end of town where no one wandered anymore. The river behind it had dried decades ago, leaving behind cracked mud and silence. Its broken wheel leaned sideways like a forgotten monument, and its windows were covered in thick grime. As she stood at the threshold, the journal and the new map tucked beneath her coat, Elsie felt like she was stepping into the very lungs of the town, into a place that had once breathed life, but now only echoed with the ghosts of what had been hidden. She pushed open the heavy door. It groaned in protest. Dust swirled like whispers as she stepped inside. Floorboards creaked with every move. But she moved with purpose, guided by the hand-drawn map and her gut. She counted the wooden beams, traced the knots in the walls, and stopped exactly where the open eye symbol had been drawn. She knelt and ran her fingers along the floor. Nothing at first. Then she found it, a narrow groove, like a trapdoor carved and covered decades ago. She pried at it with the edge of her pocket knife, the blade splintering soft wood until the panel popped up with a breath of stale air. Beneath it lay a staircase, steep and narrow, plunging into darkness. She lit her lantern, heart thudding, and descended. At the bottom, a stone chamber unfolded, damp, cold, and quiet. But it wasn't empty. Along the walls were shelves filled with ledgers, scrolls, letters, and wax-sealed documents. Wooden crates were stacked in the corners, labeled with names and dates she recognized from the journal. She was standing in a secret archive, one built by someone who'd anticipated the town's erasure of history. A vault of truth. She spent hours down there, examining the records, cross-referencing with everything she had already discovered. Names matched, timelines confirmed. Even the land clause she had found earlier was stored here in its original form, signed by Ruth herself, with a red fingerprint in place of a seal. It was undeniable now. This town had been built on stolen promises, stolen land, and stolen voices. But someone had tried to preserve the truth. Elsie realized then that she wasn't the first to carry this burden, but she might be the last. As the light in her lantern began to dim, Elsie found one final crate, pushed far behind a pillar. Inside were photographs, sepia-toned, faded, some damaged by time, but many still legible. She recognized her mother as a young girl in one. And then, in another, Ruth, standing beside a group of stern men, one of whom was Councilman Rivers's grandfather. There was a date scrawled on the back, the signing, the theft. These weren't just photos, they were proof. Undeniable. Visual proof that the current council's power had been inherited through deceit. She packed the documents carefully into her satchel and climbed back into the morning light. The town was waking up. Chimneys began to puff smoke. Doors opened. Life resumed. But everything felt different. Elsie knew she couldn't keep this secret any longer. She returned to the schoolhouse and pinned a handwritten notice to the front door. Community meeting tonight. The truth about our town. Then she set about printing copies of the photographs and documents, leaving them at the post office, the bakery, the chapel pews. No one could ignore it now. She wasn't just whispering truth. She was ringing a bell. But as the sun dipped and people began to gather in the schoolhouse, she noticed Councilman Rivers watching from his car, engine running, face hard. She held her satchel tighter. The truth was about to be told, and some would fight to keep it buried. The schoolhouse had never been so full. People crammed shoulder to shoulder, standing in doorways and pressing against window panes, just to hear what the orphan teacher had to say. A nervous hush blanketed the room, the kind of silence that trembles before a storm. Elsie stood at the front, heart pounding, clutching the satchel that carried generations of silence, now sharpened into undeniable evidence. Faces stared back, some curious, some wary, and others already angry. She didn't start with accusations. She started with a story. Her mother's quilt, the map, the journal, the grove. Every word she spoke added weight to the room, and every document she laid out before them dropped like a stone into still water, rippling through minds that had never questioned their own history. She held up the original land clause, the old photos, the signatures and seals that confirmed it all. Gasps followed. A few murmurs turned into whispered names. Eyes began darting to familiar faces, descendants of the very men who had profited from betrayal. When Elsie revealed the discovery beneath the mill, the murmurs swelled into outrage. Hattie, standing near the back, nodded slowly. Others who had known pieces of the truth now stood a little straighter. But not everyone welcomed the light. Councilman Rivers pushed his way through the crowd, his voice cutting through the noise. He called her a fraud, accused her of forging records, of spreading lies to gain sympathy. But before he could finish, an elderly man stood, one of the oldest, living farmers, and said he remembered his own father speaking of Ruth, of a debt that was never repaid. Another stood beside him, holding one of Elsie's photocopied photos. Then another. The tide turned in that instant. The room was no longer divided. It was awake. By the time the meeting ended, the town had shifted. It wasn't just about the school anymore. It was about reckoning. Days later, the Historical Commission returned with an answer, one they could no longer deny. The land deed was valid. The school was officially protected as a historical landmark. But more than that, an investigation was opened into the town's land records. Some officials quietly resigned. Others tried to negotiate behind closed doors. But the story had already spread. Regional newspapers picked it up, dubbing it the Quilt Map Scandal. Elsie didn't care for the headlines. What mattered to her was that justice had begun. She turned the schoolhouse into more than a classroom. It became a living archive. A place where anyone could walk in and read the journal. See the photos, trace the lines on the quilt. Hattie donated her antiques. The town's youth, once indifferent, now volunteered to catalog the documents. People brought forward old letters and family stories once whispered behind closed doors. The town began to tell itself the truth. As for Elsie, she remained a teacher. But now her lessons weren't just arithmetic and grammar. She taught about memory, about silence and voice. And every morning, she sat beneath the old willow grove before class, letting the wind speak through the trees. She knew her mother was proud, not just because the quilt had led her here, but because she had chosen to follow it, stitch by stitch, even when the path darkened. What began as a forgotten heirloom had become a revolution. One thread unraveled the town's silence. One teacher rewrote history, and the orphan girl who once stood alone beneath a crumbling roof had changed the town forever.